NSPAC colors. These troopers represent the New England State Police agencies at law enforcement funerals and other sanctioned events. This specialized unit serves at the discretion of the host state's respective colonel. The NSPAC Honor Guard serves a special purpose as they represent all New England troopers and their unwavering support of Sergeant Russell and his family. NSPAC projects the positive image and spirit of cooperation amongst the state police agencies of New England. Good morning. I'm Lieutenant Kevin Burton. On behalf of Colonel William Ross and the members of the Maine State Police, I thank you for joining us today here at the Point Community Center. This morning we we pay tribute to Canine Preacher, a brave and faithful member of the Maine State Police. We offer our gratitude to Chaplain Kevin Brooks, who will now provide our invocation.
Before I pray, I'd like to read some brief words that I read recently concerning police canines. His eyes are your eyes, to watch and protect you. His ears are your ears, for they safeguard in the dark. His nose is your nose, to scent, track, and lead you. His life with no greater love is yours, so you may live. We remember and honor Preacher today. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, while our hearts are heavy for the loss of Preacher, we are also filled with honor and pride because Preacher did his job so others could live. God, I especially pray for Sergeant Jonathan Russell, for the loss of his partner and friend. I ask that you continue to comfort, encourage, and strengthen him along with his family. I ask that you would also comfort and encourage and strengthen all who are grieving for this great loss. God, I ask that you would bless our time together today as we remember and honor Preacher and his service to our great state of Maine. I thank you for each one who will speak and share their thoughts and memories with us. Help them and strengthen each one of them, I ask. And I ask that we might all find words of encouragement here today, that our grieving hearts might find hope and peace. Again, God, I ask that you be present with us today and strengthen all. And I ask these things in your holy name. Amen.
Thank you, Chaplain Brooks. It is now my honor to read this written tribute, a letter from Governor Janet Mills, who is unable to be here, but offers these words of support. To members of Maine's law enforcement community, New England canine officers, and all who gather here today. Today we say our final goodbye to a beloved member of the law enforcement family, Maine State Police Canine Preacher. On February 3rd, Preacher, along with his partner, Sergeant John Russell, were in active pursuit of a fleeing suspect when Preacher was shot in the abdomen by the suspect. Preacher was rushed to an emergency veterinary clinic alongside Sergeant Russell and tactical team members, where he was stabilized but eventually succumbed to his injuries. He was surrounded by those who had worked closest with him and loved him through his final moments. Police canines know service, work, and loyalty. They fearlessly run towards danger in place of their team without hesitation. On Preacher's final day, he did exactly that, just like he had done countless times before. He will forever be remembered as a hero. Canines are not only partners and fellow law enforcement members, they're also family. The bond that is built between a canine handler and their canine over years of working together cannot be put into words. This is a heartbreaking loss, but we will all be proud and forever grateful for Preacher's service and his ultimate sacrifice. Thank you again for being here to honor Preacher. I extend my sincerest condolences to Sergeant John Russell on the loss of his partner and to the entire Maine law enforcement community. Sincerely, Governor Mills. We'll now hear from Colonel William Ross, who will join me on stage.
Thank you, Lieutenant Burton. My condolences to Sergeant Russell and his family for the loss of a preacher. He was killed in the line of duty. When I first heard that, I was pretty pissed off that someone would take the life of one of our canines. And I want to talk to everyone today about protecting and serving. I want to thank all of you for coming here today to not only honor Preacher, but to be with Sergeant Russell and his family, to be here for the Maine State Police. I'm honored to have you, and I think it's important that we have this type of memorial for a canine that was killed in the line of duty. Let's talk about for a moment what it means to protect and serve. I have some comfort here today with this group of people, because most of you know what it means to protect and serve. Because every day you go out, you cross that threshold of your door front, and you go out and you protect and serve. Whether it's a day shift, an evening shift, midnights, snowy day, rainy day, it doesn't matter. You go out. You're trained to go out. You've accepted the fact that there are dangers out there. You are there for the community to protect and serve. That's what we do. That's certainly what Sergeant Russell and Preacher did, and this tactical team did, and the first responders did on February 3rd. But we don't have to look too far. Just a couple of days ago, a couple of parking lots down here at the Main Mall, there was a shooting. Law enforcement goes in. They put themselves in harm's way, put others before them to protect and serve. Now, when we cross that threshold out of our home, when we go out, we don't know if it's going to be a good day, a bad day, an exciting day, or the unthinkable. But we know we're prepared to handle it. We're prepared to handle it because of our training, because of those of us around us, because of teams. There are people that are out there that don't understand what we do, and that's okay. There are people out there that criticize what we do, and that's okay too. But what I'm asking is for those people to listen to why we're here today, why we're here to talk about Sergeant Russell and Preacher. What did they do to protect and serve? Because it's important to know why we are all here, why we are doing this. We're doing it for the community. On February 3rd, first responders, Rustic SO, troopers, go to a residence in Portage, Aroostook County. It's a domestic violence call. They're there working it, trying to get the suspect into custody, when the unthinkable happens. That bad day comes. Aroostook County deputy is shot. Bullets start going through cruiser windows. Those people, those first responders, put their lives on the line for victims and the innocent people of that community, because that's what they do. They protect and serve. Those first responders realized that this thing had just turned for the worse. So they make the phone call. They call the State Police Tactical Team, the Crisis Negotiation Team. Sergeant Russell and Preacher are a component of that team. Highly trained people. Just like our NESPAC folks here, just as our local tactical teams are, they're prepared for these things, and they deploy. And even though I'm talking here, this doesn't happen in a matter of minutes. This whole thing is unfolding over hours and hours and hours of trying to get this suspect to come out and turn himself in without any further harm. So this tactical team here gets in place. Sergeant Russell and Preacher are in place. Our crisis negotiation team working to get this person out the door. That person makes a decision. They leave the residence. They don't want to be held accountable for what they've done. They made a decision, and we're prepared for that decision. Sergeant Russell and Preacher were positioned for just something like that to happen. Our tactical team was positioned for something like that to happen. Maine's law enforcement community are positioned to protect and serve for when things like this happen. Preacher was deployed, as he was trained to do, and he bit, not to hurt the person, but to apprehend the person to put an end to this. And in doing so, he was shot in the abdomen, sustaining some serious internal injuries. That call continued. We all know how it ended. The suspect was shot and killed. All too often we're seeing these things happen. All too often, the brave men and women of the law enforcement community are rising to the occasion to protect and serve. Now I want to talk about Preacher. He's injured. People there trying to help him. He needs a vet. The troop commander in that area is Lieutenant Brian Harris. He knows the vet in town, Presque Isle, about a half mile away. Tries frantically to get in touch with the guy, can't get in touch with him. Tells his wife, go to the house, get him up. It's exactly what happens. His wife physically shaking the vet to get out of bed. That man comes down, we're able to get Preacher to him, he's able to stabilize Preacher. But his injuries are severe. He needs to be taken to an emergency vet clinic down in the Bangor area, most likely for surgery. Sergeant Russell, Preacher, TAC team members get a convoy going down the snow-covered roads. They pull over, Preacher dies with his partner. Killed in the line of duty. A hero. That dog saved lives. That tactical team saved lives. The people in this room save lives. I hope people are listening. I hope people are listening. Now, I don't know to what extent, I'm a dog guy, but I'm not a canine handler. A dog feels emotion. I can tell you right now, Preacher, he knew that night he did good. He knew he did his job. And when he left us, I hope that's what was going through his head, that he's a good boy. Now, we're here today to memorialize Preacher, K-9 team with Sergeant Russell, JR. State Police has an award. It's the State Police K-9 of the Year Award. Pretty original. We're changing that. That award is now going to be in honor of this brave K-9 team, Sergeant Russell and Preacher, so that other teams and other people that look to what happened on February 3rd into the early morning hours of February 4th never forget what protecting and serving is. This is the harsh reality of it, and I hope people are listening. I'm very proud of Sergeant Russell. I'm very proud of the bravery of Preacher. I'm proud of my tactical team. I'm proud of my first responders. I'm proud of my troopers and the greater law enforcement community for stepping up and taking care of the citizens of Maine. We do a great job day in and day out, and I want you to know it. Thank you. Stay safe. And Sergeant Russell, your family, Preacher's in heaven. God bless them. Thank you.
Thank you, Colonel. Next to share their remarks and join me on stage is Sergeant G.J. Nagel.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this memorial service as we gather here together to honor Canine Preacher for his actions of aggressively challenging an armed adversary and sustaining fatal injuries to protect the lives of his fellow human law enforcement officers. I want to personally thank each and every one of you who are present here today to support John, his wife Sarah, and their 3 young, beautiful children, Sophie, Scarlett, and Stevie, as well as our law enforcement community as a whole, as together, united as one, we grieve the loss of Canine Preacher and support John during this extremely difficult time. Words can't truly express how amazing it is to see your unwavering support on display, as many of you traveled here from all across our great state of Maine and beyond, convening here today from other New England states in honor of Canine Preacher. I often tell new handlers that the police canine family is a family within a family, and those words stand true here today. Again, I sincerely thank you all for attending. John, as I know Preacher is gone from earth forever and can never be replaced, I pray that you and your family will feel the Lord's comfort and peace. I trust he is faithful and will allow this celebration of Preacher's life to bring you solace. As I ruminated over what to say here today, I decided I'd like to share with each of you how I first met John, a little background about Preacher, one of the many things he taught me personally, and then a few quick stories as we remember the legacy he left behind. In September of 2013, I was employed as a deputy sheriff for the Kennebec County Sheriff's Office. I was a canine handler and a member of the State Police Canine Training Unit. During this time, I happened to be in the hiring process for the Maine State Police and would later be hired in December. One day while I was off duty, I went to my family camp in Oxford County. Upon arriving, I found that the front door had been kicked in and a few things missing from inside. I reported the burglary and learned the State Police were covering the area at the time. Lo and behold, a young trooper named John Russell was assigned to this call for service and showed up at my camp. I had previously heard of John and was aware he would soon be joining the canine unit with his very first canine partner, Gus, but I had never met him before. John and Gus attended the next patrol school in the spring and successfully graduated in June of 2014. In this same month, I was reunited with the canine unit after completing the hiring process, graduating from the 65th Recruit Training Troop, and then completing field training. From that summer on, I had the opportunity to train alongside John in the training unit, and it didn't take long for me to realize that he was going to be the real deal as a canine handler. On a consistent and regular basis, as he strived to become the most reliable and successful canine team in our training unit. Through his hard work, dedication, and commitment, John and Gus went on to have a highly successful career. As the years went on, John became a member of the training staff for the unit and continues to serve in that capacity today. In 2022, Gus's decorated career came to an end, and in the fall, John was issued a new dog. At this juncture in time, John was already serving on our tactical team, and we had been teammates for a year and a half. We knew this SWAT-level dog required certain traits, and as you can imagine, John was elated to have the opportunity to train a dog from the get-go as a team dog. Due to the nature of the calls that the team responds to and the situations that our dogs are put into on a regular basis with the expectation they will perform at any and all cost, the selection process for a higher caliber, top-tier dog is arduous, but is a requirement. It's a must-have. These dogs are purchased, trained, and maintained to the highest level we know how, as they are force multipliers and help reduce risk to our teammates while apprehending the most violent, dangerous offenders in our state. To put it in the simplest terms, these dogs must be fearless. As the time drew near for John to start the new dog selection process, I shared his excitement with him. I wasn't only happy for him, but I was also happy for our team. I knew once he was paired up with the right team dog, together as a canine team, they would go on to help bolster our team's capabilities. I wholeheartedly believe they would become a true asset for our team, and boy, didn't they ever. As a small token of appreciation and to ensure their ultimate sacrifices are never forgotten, many of the working dogs in our unit are named after fallen troopers. In 2018, our other team dog was named in remembrance of fallen Jeffrey Parola, who was a member of our tactical team. When John received his new dog for our team, our teammate, Eric Susi, came up with the idea of naming our new four-legged teammate after Chaplain Don Williams, who didn't die in the line of duty, but had unequivocally lived a selfless life and was highly respected by everyone who knew him. Chaplain Williams served multiple different law enforcement agencies while also pastoring a church in Augusta for 30 consecutive years. Well before the inception of my time on the team, Chaplain Williams earned the trust earned the trust of the members of the Maine State Police tactical team and was deeply embedded as the team chaplain. One of his nicknames around church, the team, and the agencies we served happened to be Preacher Man. John quickly adopted the idea of naming his new partner after Preacher Man and ultimately chose the name Preacher. Little did we know then that in just a few short years we would know exactly how fitting and appropriate Preacher's name really was. As I mentioned, Don lived a selfless life and always put others first. For everyone here who knew him, you know that cannot be overstated. And Preacher did just that. Preacher exemplified Don by living a selfless life. He made the ultimate sacrifice without fear or hesitation by courageously laying down his life to help protect everyone else around him. I'll never forget that late afternoon in the fall of 2022 when John and I helped screen Preacher. This was the first day John had met Preacher. One of the first tests we administered was a courage test. For those who aren't familiar, this is a very simple yet common test for screening working dogs. We leave the dog alone in an unfamiliar environment, and once they settle in, we have a decoy approach them, acting strangely and suspiciously to see what the dog will do. It's basically a fight or flight test. Will they defend themselves, or will they turn and run because they're alone and scared? Do they have what it takes to fight and defend themselves without having a handler present? During the test, depending on how the dog reacts, determines how much pressure is put on them. By pressure, I mean how close the decoy gets to the dog without allowing them to bite, because the decoy should not have any protective equipment on to help simulate a real-world encounter with a suspect. Well, there we go. John and I back-tied Preacher to a tree at the canine office, which was a new environment to him, and left him outside alone for 15 to 20 minutes to let him settle down. We returned inside and watched him periodically out the window. Preacher was being his typical self, pacing and trying to run free away from the tree, but eventually settled in and laid down with some slack in the line on the ground behind him. In retrospect, I should have maintained a better visual of Preacher as darkness was closing in, because he wasn't just laying there like I had assumed. When John gave me the green light, I stepped outside as the decoy to perform the test. I was dressed in civilian clothes, wearing a hooded sweatshirt. I had my hood up, rattlestick in hand to use for agitation, and no protective equipment. As I slowly approached Preacher, I carefully assessed his body language. He picked me up visually and keyed in as he remained in the down position. As I slowly advanced towards him, making sharp, abrupt movements, he slowly stood up and really keyed in on me. He remained stationary but stretched his neck out towards me, as if he was focusing his eyesight or stalking me like a wild cat. As I closed distance on Preacher, I sensed the pressure building inside of him. I knew whatever his reaction was going to be, it was imminent. He was either going to charge at me full speed and do a backflip when he ran out of slack, or he was going to turn and run away in fear, which would conclude our testing process. A second later, Preacher took off like the firm missile he was and charged straight at me. I quickly thought to myself, attaboy, he's got what it takes for this phase of the process. Before I could finish that entire thought in my mind, I realized he was getting extremely close and should have done that self-initiated backflip by now, but he hadn't. A half second later, I realized he had chewed through the nylon back-tide and was coming at me full speed to actually apprehend me to protect himself. As he launched at me full speed, I was able to use the rattlestick I was using for agitation as a tug and caught him on that instead of my arm. I quickly grabbed a hold of him by the collar and held him in the air away from my body as he continued to try and bite me. John and Sergeant Dalton immediately came running out of the office to get him. Although they may have been laughing at the circumstances, I wasn't, because at the time I didn't find it comical at all. But I managed to share a smile with him because I was happy with Preacher's performance. I knew he had just passed the test. That was one of the many important lessons Preacher taught me personally. Don't use a nylon back tie for the courage test in the future. Got it. Roger that, Preacher. Thank you. Preacher went on and made it through the selection, became a team dog. With any new dog around the team, just like a new operator, the dog needs to earn the trust of his teammates. Because of the high level of drive Preacher possessed, earning trust took some time with some challenges along the way. His two biggest challenges in the SWAT environment were these: stay quiet on perimeter and don't bite your teammates. Sounds simple, right? It's not. For those who have never worked a truly high drive dog, to accomplish these two tasks takes hundreds of training hours. Although we and our teammates wish we could achieve this overnight, we can't. And if we could, we would, because we know just how critical it is for the safety of our teammates and the success of our missions. To think back to where Preacher's decimal rating was just 2 years ago on the soundboard from a perimeter position to where he was during last week's incident speaks volumes to John's personal dedication and commitment to his training. I know John trained hundreds, if not thousands of hours for that moment on February 3rd when he sent him for that apprehension. Preacher remained quiet in the seconds before being sent, which was a difference maker. Preacher knew what he had to do to protect John and his other teammates to give them the best chance of survival, knowing if he was loud, he'd give away their position and they'd more than likely take gunfire before having any reactionary time in a very rapidly evolving, tense, and uncertain situation. Preacher displayed his unconditional loyalty and love for you, John, and our team, as he pursued this suspect, because he knew just how dangerous he was. Another memory of Preacher I'd like to share was the first live apprehension I was present for. This was a call in 2023 when our team was executing a high-risk search warrant for a violent suspect who had committed some burglaries, thefts, home invasions, and had managed to elude the police multiple times. Preacher was still new to the team and was still in that earning of the trust phase. As we kind of expected, upon arriving on target and announcing our presence, the suspect decided to flee Seaside, directly towards John and Preacher's perimeter position. As they exposed themselves to challenge the suspect, he made a terrible decision. Instead of surrendering, he does an about-face and flees straight away from them across the open yard towards the woods on the B-side. While this is occurring in the backyard, I'm in the driveway, standing behind the Bearcat because we had other compliant people coming out the front door and encountered someone in a parked vehicle in the driveway that the React team was now taken into custody. I heard over comms that the suspect was fleeing Seaside and that Preacher was being sent off lead towards B for an apprehension. We all paused as we knew that the suspect Preacher was pursuing was our primary target. As we made a hasty assessment and considered shifting resources to help contain him, I remember thinking to myself, shouldn't we be hearing some vocalization by now from the suspect? Preacher ought to be on him by now. Maybe we should just get back in the truck and button up and drive up the road in case he pops out of the woods, because having Preacher loose, running around, was throwing off my own OODA loop. In that moment, Preacher was a real concern of mine. We hadn't quite yet conquered a strong foundation of operator neutrality up to this point in his training, and as John would often call him, he was still considered an equal opportunity dog. Had he rounded that corner from the backyard into the front yard and saw us, we'd become his target instead of the suspect. I knew we'd now have two problems on our hands, the suspect trying to break perimeter and Preacher man on one of us. Thankfully, what felt like 3 minutes was probably 15 to 20 seconds, and then we heard it coming from the woods. We knew Preacher had made contact, but still there was no radio traffic for a few seconds. I remember thinking, oh no, I hope that's not one of our teammates in the woods on the B-side. Seconds later, we received radio confirmation that the suspect was in fact in custody, thanks to Preacher. Preacher was a very strong dog, both mentally and physically. When it came to his physical abilities, he performed like a professional athlete. One day in training, we were doing bite work, working on environmentals in tight spaces. We were in an old building with a large radiator on the wall. The water pipe was exposed and there was a bleeder valve on the very end of the radiator. I set up some obstacles and created a tight, dark space up against the wall to work Preacher into. Honestly, the obstacles were in place by design to help him slow down, so he wouldn't hit me at full speed like he always did. Preacher had no rev limiter. He always idled on the red line during bite work. Preacher entered the room and hit me like a ton of bricks in the darkness. He hit me so hard and knocked me back into the wall. I inadvertently hit the bleeder valve and broke it off the water pipe, causing that old, musty smelling stagnant water to spray everywhere. I'll never forget the look on John's face when he came in and witnessed Preacher and I doing the slip and slide with Preacher biting my arm. We were both soaking wet, and John being John looked at me and said, well, there, we're training environmentals, and I guess old Preach got some unintentional real-life exposures. A friend recently shared some canine line of duty death stats with me from the Officer Down Memorial page. In 2024, there were 20 police canine line of duty deaths across the country. So far in 2025, there have been 3, including Preachers. As police canine handlers, we know that these tragedies are a real possibility in our line of work. But when it becomes a reality, I can only imagine there are no words that can make the pain go away. John, I've never experienced losing a canine partner in the line of duty, but I know it's a nightmare for you. I pray you'll never go through this again, and that each handler here who hasn't experienced it never will. As we pay our respects and say goodbye to John's beloved 3-year-old partner, Preacher, let us be reminded of his unwavering loyalty to John and his fellow human officers and the citizens we serve. Preacher was more than a trusted partner and faithful friend. He was a member of the Russell family. John will have other canine partners in the future, but never another one like Preacher, as he was so special in his own way. On February 4th, when Preacher was taken from us, I started having flashbacks of snapshots throughout his career. I thought back to that moment in time of the courage test and laughed to myself, acknowledging the fact that on his very first day with us, he showed us just how much courage he had, just like he did on his final day with us. Although his life was short and he was taken much too soon, Preacher was a great example to all of us, as he showed us it's not in the years in your life that count, it's the life in your years. Canine Preacher's sacrifice and service will never be forgotten, and the impact he had on protecting the lives of his handler and fellow teammates will resonate for years to come. At this time, it is my distinct honor and privilege to introduce Canine Preacher's handler, Sergeant John Russell, as he will share some words of remembrance.
All right. If you'll all bear with me, as some of my teammates know, I can get a little long-winded. But I promise, if you just stick with me, you may find some entertainment in the story, and there may come some somber. But before we get to that, I'd just like to start out by thanking everybody that's in the room at this time. Specifically, I'd like to begin by thanking Colonel Ross, members of our command staff, and all other distinguished visitors that are here with us in attendance for today's service. I'd also like to give special thanks to the members of Ashland Ambulance Service who expeditiously transported Preacher and I from the scene in Portage Lake to the Presque Isle Animal Hospital, as well as the officers from Presque Isle PD that cleared the way ahead of us during that transport. There wasn't a lot to shut down in Aroostook County that night, but if they had, they were on it, and I appreciate it. My heartfelt thanks to the staff of the Presque Isle Animal Hospital who sprung into action at a moment's notice and came in from their homes to open their facility, all in time to receive us upon our arrival, immediately starting their tireless efforts to begin actions to attempt to save Preacher's life. I will never forget how hard and diligently you worked to save my partner. Thank you to my teammates that assisted me and Preacher in every way possible after his injuries, and especially team medic Pat Hall, for the high level of care, compassion, and effort you provided to Preacher as we worked to move him from Presque Isle to Brewer, as well as everything you've all done for me and my family in the days following his unfortunate passing. You have been nothing short of an extension of my family, and I will never forget the feeling of brotherhood you have given me and my family during this time. Thank you to the staff at Eastern Maine Emergency Veterinary Clinic in Brewer, who even after Preacher's passing, welcomed him into your facility compassionately with open arms, providing a place for him to rest while further arrangements could be made. Thanks to the staff at Final Gift Pet Memorial Center in Turner for handling my partner with the utmost compassion and dignity. Your professionalism really shined through in an extremely dark time. Last but certainly not least, I would like to thank all of my brothers and sisters in blue, as well as the citizens across the state, throughout New England, and even across the country that have taken time to reach out to me, my family, my team, and our agency as a whole, offering your thoughts, your condolences, kind gestures, and general concern for us during this difficult time. Now, if you'll bear with me, I just want to kind of give you guys a story of Preacher's entire life, and we'll get to the night at hand, but I want you to understand what he was through and through. The story of Preacher and I's time together, our paths crossed while we were both at a bit of a crossroads. It was the middle of July in 2022. I had recently finished a patrol school with my second patrol dog, Gordy. However, Gordy was presenting significant workability issues as a team dog, largely centered around a lack of aggression, and the frustration had finally come to a head, resulting in the decision for him to be retired immediately. This kicked off a rapid search for a new dog, which would have a big responsibility serving as one of two patrol canines assigned to our tactical team at the time. So to say there was a little pressure on the situation would be an understatement. At this time, Preacher was about a year old. He went by the name of Azar. Azar had been imported from somewhere in Europe to a vendor in Naugatuck, Connecticut, called Black Rock Canines. Black Rock Canines had been effectively shut down at the end of May of 2022 in the midst of animal cruelty allegations, including the killing of dogs that were in their inventory that didn't make the grade. These allegations have been launched by a gentleman named Ken Ballinger, who had recently become a head trainer at the facility, thus learning of the shady business practices that have been going on, including the animal cruelty, leading him to file a report, ultimately leading to the owner being arrested and the facility shut down. Now, this is where the story begins to have a little bit of, call it whatever you want, fate, divine intervention, but some circumstances that really make it feel like Preacher and I were meant to be. Just prior to that facility being shut down, they had recently fulfilled a contract with the U.S. Border Patrol to supply them with 10 dogs. Azar had been selected as one of those 10 dogs by the Border Patrol reps that had gone to that facility, screened and selected their dogs. Following the owner's arrest and the rest of the staff fearing the impending seizure of the remaining dogs at the facility, they rushed to get the 10 dogs that had been selected prepared for shipment to the Border Patrol. In the days following, their concerns would become reality, and all the remaining dogs in their inventory were seized and placed in animal shelters across the state of Connecticut, with their futures up in the air and hanging in the balance. Ken Ballinger had traveled up to Maine and done some decoy instruction during our most recent patrol school that had taken place in the spring and summer of 2022. And in the process, our principal canine trainer, Sergeant Scott Dalton, had formed a friendship with Ken. So naturally, as we were now facing this imminent need for a new dog, Scott reached out to Ken, and they agreed to meet down in Connecticut and made arrangements to go and take a look at the remaining Black Rock dogs that were in the shelters. Shortly after getting to the first shelter, Ken immediately recognized Azar, who the shelter had on record as a dog named Franco. Now you see, Azar had been a bit of a personal project of Ken's while he was back at Black Rock. He knew the dog well, and knowing what we were looking for, he knew Azar would be the perfect fit. After going through the red tape to get Azar out of the shelter, Sergeant Dalton transported him back to Maine. Myself and my teammate, and a huge personal mentor of mine, Sergeant G.J. Nagel, who you just heard from, met Azar for the first time on a humid summer night in early August. We had arranged to screen the dog in the late afternoon and into the evening hours so we could see him in both daylight and transition into dark and low-light conditions. I remember the first time I opened the car door to retrieve him from the kennel. He came out like he was shot out of a cannon. He presented as a dog that was very confident and excited to get to work. What we did for a screening process wasn't rocket science. We tested Azar's environmentals. We couldn't find anything in the world that he balked at. We tested his hunt drive by teasing him with a ball, throwing it out into an overgrown pasture with grass that was about 3 or 4 feet tall. We spun him around in a bunch of 360s to disorient him from the search area. And after we were convinced that he didn't know where the ball went, we sent him into the field. He searched relentlessly for over 8 minutes, and when he finally did find the ball, he damn near stood straight up on his nose. He drove it into the ground so hard to retrieve it. I should add that the goal of this test was not to measure how quickly Azar could find the toy, but more a measurement of how hard and how long would he search for it without giving up. He had no quit. In fact, the longer it went, the more feverish he seemed to work. After the hunt drive test, it was beginning to get dark, and we wanted to do what we call a courage test, which just so happens you've heard a little bit about. We wanted to do this test before giving Azar a chance to get a bite. I want to paint this picture as well as I can because this is where things began to get a little dynamic. We set this test up with Azar in a harness attached to a thick nylon tie-out, essentially a cargo tie-down strap. It was about 25 feet long. After he was tied out, myself, Sergeant Nagel, and Scott Dalton all returned inside the office where we stayed for about 10 to 15 minutes, allowing Azar to just settle in and get neutral to his environment. Once inside, we watched Azar from the corner office windows. He laid down in the grass and seemed to settle in, After a short time, he laid down. As we watched him, he appeared to be eating the grass around him, which is not uncommon. He'd just been transported. His stomach could be uneasy. Dogs chew grass all the time. The plan for this exercise was that GJ would be the decoy. He would not be wearing any bite equipment, as the mere sight of bite equipment alone can stimulate a dog of this caliber and present false confidence. Upon exiting the building, GJ would walk in a suspicious or stalking manner across the parking lot toward Azar. At some point in time, Azar would have to make a decision, essentially to fight or flee from the area to avoid the conflict of this suspicious person. As GJ exited the office, he had his hooded sweatshirt hood covering his head, armed with nothing but a wooden rattlestick in his right hand. As he approached Azar, he started out walking normally at a slow pace. As he made it about halfway across the parking lot, he slowed down, kind of lowered his shoulders, and presented his already menacing stature in an even more suspicious demeanor, continuing to progress toward the dog. Azar quickly got up on all fours, and as GJ took a few more steps, Azar quickly decided he didn't like what he was seeing. He lunged forward. It should be noted that GJ was likely still about 50 feet away and well outside the distance of the 25-foot back tie Azar was anchored to. Azar was exhibiting the exact meet force with force response we had hoped to see, well before any real provocation. I liked what I was seeing, and GJ's safety never even entered my mind. I mean, at the end of the day, we just had a really angry dog closing ground at the speed of sound on a decoy with no equipment, but he was anchored to a back tie, right? Well, as it turns out, Azar hadn't been lying down eating grass while becoming neutral to his environment. He had gone to work with his razor-sharp teeth on the nylon back tie. By the time GJ approached him, there was either just a little of the nylon line left attached or none at all. Azar got to the point where the line should have been restricting him and the reality sank in. There was no more line. Azar was in a dead sprint toward GJ, and it was clear nothing was stopping him at this point. Well, luckily for his own welfare, GJ is a bit of a magician when it comes to working dogs. He was able to feed that frail bamboo rattlestick in between him and Azar, successfully feeding it just about as deep into Azar's clacking jaws as he could get it, fending him off just long enough for me and Scotty to rush out of the office and wrangle Azar before any bloodshed occurred. I was relieved GJ hadn't been hurt, but I'd be lying to you if I wasn't laughing hysterically on the inside. Needless to say, courage, check. Oh, and a bit of resourcefulness as well. Lastly, we moved to the intentional bite stuff. I won't bore you with a long story on that, but we were all impressed. Azar was deployed for several bites on a full bite suit. He demonstrated a great grip right out of the gate, deep on the bite to the point it was miraculous he could still manage to take in oxygen with his mouth as full of material as it was, and GJ reported that the bite pressure was more than sufficient. We mixed in a few distractions throughout, including the deployment of a flashbang grenade, simulated gunfire. None of this seemed to deter young Azar. If anything, it just made him more angry. Throughout that afternoon and evening, I had primarily been the one to handle Azar. When you screen or test dogs, you're also training dogs, and you begin to develop a connection with them. Maybe it was due to the fact he had spent the last several months cooped up in an animal shelter, but that night it became clear that he was seeking companionship just as much, if not more, than I was. He struck me as a dog that was confident. He was young but exuded enormous potential. He was extremely tenacious and he was full of heart. Ultimately, Azar became my partner that night. After selecting Azar to be my partner, I decided to change his name. Over the years, it has been customary within our canine unit to name our dogs after fallen troopers. Knowing that he would be one of the two canines specifically assigned to our tactical team, I wanted to give him a name that had a special meaning, not only to our agency, but even more so to the brotherhood of our team. Don Williams had served as a chaplain for the State Police, the Kennebec County Sheriff's Office, and the Augusta Police Department for many, many years before passing away in 2019. During his tenure, Don had become extremely beloved by members of our team. Whenever the tactical team would respond to a call, oftentimes Don would respond along with them and hang out at the command post for the duration of the call, praying for them both as a team and with members individually before or after a call if they so desired. In the later years of Don's tenure, it became more difficult for him to physically respond to all the calls across the state, but his dedication to his craft never wavered, and his calmness and spiritual comfort was immeasurable for team members of his era. You didn't have to venture very far to have a conversation with a TAC team member that served during Don's tenure to understand what Don had meant to them. In tribute to Don, and in order to keep his legacy alive, as well as a shade of the comfort he provided to the team, I decided to rename Azar Preacher in honor of Don. At the beginning of September of 2022, just shortly after he was selected, Preacher and I began an accelerated patrol school. The school would span 8 weeks in length compared to the normal 14-week program. We had a group of dedicated trainers, and there were only 2 teams in the class, myself and Preacher, and Sergeant J.P. Lacoste and his canine Mosca. This could be a daunting task to get a patrol canine fully prepared for certification in this span of time, but Preacher was up for it. Compared to the dog I had previously had that didn't work out, I would often joke that I'd been upgraded from a Ford Fiesta to a Ferrari. Preacher was not the type of dog that needed any building up. He was tenacious, about as smart as any dog I ever have seen, either as a trainer or personally handled. He was the type of dog that connected the dots extremely fast. In fact, it's no joke when I say I was just fortunate to have the privilege to hold the dumb end of the leash and watch him do his work. I think as a patrol dog handler, we all want a dog that can do everything well. But secretly, we all know we want a dog that excels at aggression work and officer protection. Preacher did not disappoint. He was not huge in physical size, weighing in between 65 and 70 pounds, depending on how much beef jerky I'd share with him on any given week. But when he worked, he left everything out on the line, using every ounce of his body to impactfully strike decoys. He was a straight-line attacker, and decoys didn't just need to worry about his bite. They needed to be prepared to catch him in full launch mode. You hear about basketball players posterizing opponents by driving the lane and ferociously dunking over a helpless defender. Well, in the canine world, I would say the equivalent would be when a 65-pound fur missile strikes a decoy, taking them clean off their feet. Preacher certainly posterized a fair amount of unassuming decoys. It is not at all an exaggeration to stand here and tell you, watching Preacher do his thing often left me in awe. Now, I'm sure you're starting to get the impression that everything just went perfectly with Preacher and I, and we never had any challenges. Well, not quite. Preacher was very stubborn, and Preacher wanted what Preacher wanted when Preacher wanted it. This did present some challenges for us early on while teaching him to out. One afternoon in particular, while working on his release, Preacher was engaged with a large tug. I'd commanded Preacher to out, which he had about zero intention of doing. So in turn, he received a little stimulation from an electronic training collar. Back to my earlier statement about Preacher being pretty smart. Well, it didn't take him long to figure out that electronic stim essentially came from me. Preacher spit that tug and immediately turned around 180 degrees and latched onto the back of my calf, where he remained for about the next 3 seconds. When he was satisfied that he had sent me a message, he let go, stood up right in front of me with a puffed up chest, looked me square in the eyes, and if he could have talked, I know he would have said something like, "What are you going to do now?" I received his message. We simply adapted our training approach. We'd give Preacher a bite. As soon as he'd release, we'd give him another bite, over and over and over again. In his mind, releasing just became a path to getting another bite. It would be a bit of a misrepresentation to say our problems were solved with the shake of a magic wand, but we made progress pretty quickly from there. It is often said that good training sometimes comes at the price of a little pain and discomfort, but at the end of the day, I knew what I had in Preacher, and I was happy to have the problems on the over-the-top end of the spectrum rather than the other way around. One other big challenge we had was when Preacher wanted to start something, he wanted to start immediately. If you held him back, he could get a bit loud. If you've ever seen a Formula One car or a top fuel dragster sitting at the starting line, revving at about 10,000 RPMs, just waiting for the lights on the tree to go from red to yellow to green to time that perfect launch. Well, that was Preacher. Except Preacher could keep himself bottled up for just about long enough to make it to the lights turning yellow, and then he'd often lose his mind. In that moment, he was ready to go, and I became the thing obstructing him from whatever it was he desired. Preacher wasn't real subtle about how he chose to deal with this, and he would often take a shot at the title. This led to many conversations, or as some of the people close to us that may have witnessed a few of these conversations occur, that have been dubbed domestics between Preacher and I. Over time, he began to grasp the concept that he got to go when I decided, or he didn't get to go at all. We learned how to understand each other over time, but with a dog as wound for sound as Preacher was, this was certainly something that ebbed and flowed. Ultimately, Preacher and I completed our patrol school at the end of November of 2022, obtaining our Maine Criminal Justice Academy patrol team certification, and we hit the ground running with our team. It may be hard to fathom that a dog that was as high-strung as Preacher had a soft side to him, but he really did. As the canine handler, most of us end up spending more time with our partner than we do really with anyone. Our best human friends, our wives, our kids, you name it. This was no different for me and Preach, and we did spend a lot of one-on-one time together, both at work and at home. Preacher lived in an 8x8 kennel housed in my basement. In the mornings, when I'd go down to get him out, as soon as that kennel door would open, he'd spring out of there much like the first day I'd met him, jump up, standing on his back legs with his front paws on my chest. There was no malicious intent to this. It was just his way of saying good morning, essentially in the form of a dog hug. I learned fairly quickly that going down to get him out with my morning coffee still in hand was probably ill-advised. But I'm a slow learner, so he made me wear it on more than one occasion. After that little routine, we'd go outside and exercise some demons. This was just my term for burning some of his early morning high-octane fuel off. If it was the summer months, he'd chase a ball around the backyard for just as long as you were willing to throw it to him. If it was the winter months when the ground was snow-covered, we would do the same thing. I'd just change the ball for a frisbee so it wouldn't get planted deep below the snow. Preacher was so fast that on most occasions he would catch up to that frisbee long before it ever came down out of the air. Watching him launch up and snatch that thing out of the air was nothing short of majestic. When my wife and kids would be gone, I would occasionally bring Preacher into the main part of the house. This was pretty seldom, though, as Preacher was not your average house dog and he had zero limitations. In fact, any chance he would get, he would make an agility course out of anything he could in the house. I can't even tell you how many times he would often clear the contents of our kitchen island off while trying to scale it. Upon Preacher's patrol certification in November 2022, we immediately started deploying to nearly every activation our tactical team responded to from that point on. We were the junior tenured canine team within our team alongside the legendary team of G.J. Nagel and K9 Jr. So Preacher and I were typically, or I would say primarily, assigned to the perimeter team at calls, which we fully embraced, so much so that he and I had contemplated getting matching tattoos labeling us as Seaside for life. In all seriousness, we were proud and honored to be able to serve on the team at all, and we took the opportunity to be able to lock down perimeter and prevent any of the people we were dealing with from fleeing very seriously. It wasn't too long after we became fully certified that we found ourselves rapidly deploying to a perimeter position at a surrounding call-out search warrant at a house full of drug traffickers. Myself and Preacher, along with our teammate Marcus Rennie, made it to our spot behind the house undetected. Not long after our armored vehicle began giving announcements at the front side of the house, I thought Preacher was going to get his chance to prove himself. Marcus and I were watching a basement-level window on a walkout-style basement. It was the type that would slide open from left to right. We were in total darkness, but due to the interior lights in the residence, we could see a person very obviously come to the window, slide the window open. One leg came out, top half came out. I thought to myself, here it comes. You're going to get your first chance, Preach. Just as that thought had crossed my mind, my furry little Formula One car that I mentioned earlier had seen everything we had been seeing, and he had enough. He lunged toward the window, nearly dislocating my left shoulder when he got to the end of the leash, and started barking. And just like that, top half back in, leg back in, window slide shut. It worked out well, because it wasn't more than 15 seconds later, that same subject went upstairs, walked to the front door, came out with his hands up, and was taken into custody without incident. A wise decision on his part, but the emphasis was, we have to be quiet. It's easier said than done with a young dog in a perimeter environment, sometimes extending several hours at a time. But we worked noise discipline as a priority training point from that time on, and with training gains and natural maturity, Preacher had made huge strides. In the summer of 2023, Preacher got a chance to prove himself to the team. We rapidly deployed to a wooded area in the town of Chelsea, working intel that a wanted DV subject who was believed to be armed and dangerous and had been on the run for several days was in the area. Upon arrival, Preacher was cast in the area and immediately picked up a track and led team members on a track through the woods that ultimately ended up locating that subject and ended in a deadly force encounter. A few months later, we deployed to the town of Patton and surrounded a residence after patrol units had obtained a search warrant for a subject that had committed an armed home invasion some time prior. Shortly after our arrival and getting set on perimeter, the suspect emerged out of a camper in the backyard, attempted to break perimeter, and flee into the woods. It was a moment of truth for Preacher and I, as this would be his first real apprehension opportunity. Preacher had him in his sights as plain as day, and after disregarding a challenge to stop, the suspect turned 180 degrees, running straight away from us. As I released Preacher to go and apprehend him, both the suspect, followed by Preacher, who was closing the distance on him at a rapid rate, disappeared into the woods out of sight. It wasn't too long after that I heard sounds pretty symbolic of someone getting bit by a dog. And I knew Preacher had done what I always knew he could do, but no matter what you think, it's never real until it's real. Sure enough, upon approach, Preacher had him down on the ground, solidly attached to his right arm. In fact, he'd done everything but put the fellow in handcuffs for us. On our team, you earn your place here every day. And on that day, Preacher was put to the test, and he had passed in flying colors. He proved to his teammates what I already knew he could do, and he had now earned the trust and respect of everyone on our team. From that point on, I think it's fairly safe to assume that Preacher provided everyone with some peace of mind that if we had someone trying to break perimeter, he was going to handle it. And I don't mean to put that mildly. That is a task that, until shown you can achieve it, cannot be taken for granted. In the summer of 2024, our team responded to Lewiston after a male suspect had exchanged gunfire with the Lewiston Police Department and fled into a wooded area. After locking down the area and surveying it with drones, an area of concern was located shortly into the woodline, in a position that was just not safely accessible for operators to access. Preacher deployed ahead of the team, locating the subject and engaging in a bite and hold on his upper leg, which later led to a rumor that our team was now deploying with dragons. Truth is, Preacher just happened to engage the suspect's upper leg area where an iPhone had been in his pants pocket. When Preacher engaged him, the phone ended up between the suspect's leg and Preacher's jaws. The phone got crushed, causing the lithium battery to explode and catch on fire. Ultimately, the suspect was found to have taken his own life with a self-inflicted gunshot wound, but Preacher made the team's approach a lot safer, both in feeling and reality. As an operator or a contributor of any type on a SWAT team, you always want to have confidence in whatever it is you bring to the fight. If you're a sniper and you're worried your sight got knocked around and lost at zero, you'd immediately go to the range and re-zero it. If you had a non-lethal munition cartridge of any type that expired, or you were concerned that it got exposed to some element that would question its effectiveness moving forward, you would replace it. No questions asked. If you're a canine handler on a SWAT team, you train the hell out of your dog to be as ready as you can be for anything you can do to help your team and to keep your team members as safe as possible in everything you do or may have to do. And with Preacher, I never had any doubt in my mind at any time that he was ready and prepared to take action. And that provided huge peace of mind for me and huge comfort for our teammates. Preacher had earned their rating of reliability. As everyone knows by now, on the afternoon of February 3rd, our team responded to Portage Lake. a small town in Aroostook County, after patrol-level resources had responded for a domestic incident where a male suspect had assaulted his wife. She was able to evacuate and flee from the residence, but she was not able to take their newborn baby with her. Patrol resources from the State Police and the Aroostook County Sheriff's Office had responded to investigate that incident. During their investigation, they were able to get the suspect to come outside, and upon trying to apprehend him, he was able to flee back into his residence, eventually pulling a pistol and exchanging gunfire with the patrol units. After making it back inside with the baby, he again engaged law enforcement officers with a high-powered rifle from the second story of the building as they tried to evacuate the immediate area to containment positions. Ultimately, he struck Deputy Shane Campbell in his shoulder through the windshield of his patrol vehicle. This chain of events resulted in our team being activated to this dynamic situation. Just after 3 p.m., I arrived with Preacher, and we were assigned to a perimeter position along with our teammates, Andrew Hardy and Pat Flanagan. For several hours after our arrival, negotiators continued attempts to get the suspect to exit in hopes of a peaceful resolution. These efforts stalled out, and the suspect remained barricaded inside his apartment for several hours. The call had seemingly drawn to a standstill. Shortly after 7:30 p.m., the suspect attempted to flee his residence in a vehicle that had been parked inside a garage on the ground level underneath his apartment. One of our armored vehicles was able to disable the vehicle shortly after its attempt to flee, and I shifted with Preacher from my perimeter position to try and get into a spot to intercept the suspect should he decide to flee on foot from the vehicle. Shortly after shifting, the suspect exited his vehicle and began fleeing on foot in the direction of the command post in the Portage Lake Village. The whereabouts of the baby were unknown at this time. Our position was all that remained between he and numerous subjects in the village and at the command post. Preacher was locked on as he was seeing all of this unfold just as clearly as I was. I then made a decision that will haunt me for the rest of my life. In Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman's book, On Combat, The Psychology and Physiology of Deadly Conflict in War and Peace, he quoted Athenian general Thucydides as follows: "The bravest are surely those who have the clearest vision of what is before them, glory and danger alike, and yet notwithstanding go out to meet it." As the suspect fled, I could see that he had nothing in his hands and he was running for all he was worth. I leaned down to Preacher and I lightly said to him his 2 favorite words: "Get him." Preacher, who was ready to go long before I had given him the green light, quickly sprung into action, bearing down with all of his might and tenacity toward the suspect. As he neared the suspect, my and any handler's worst nightmare became reality as the suspect reached into his waistband, producing a pistol. Preacher never hesitated and lunged toward the suspect's left arm. Preacher engaged him in his left arm, and the subject subsequently fired 2 shots at Preacher. Preacher clearly had been struck as he let out a yelp, causing him to disengage from the bite, but his efforts knocked the suspect off balance, and when he regained his balance, he began to orient the pistol at Preacher's teammates on perimeter, who engaged the suspect, neutralizing the threat. Preacher returned to me under his own power, and immediate efforts to get him back to the command post and to an ambulance that was already coordinated by our crisis negotiation team to be waiting for us began. Upon our arrival at the command post, the Ashland ambulance crew met us, and we immediately began an expeditious response to the Presque Isle Animal Hospital, which was approximately 35 miles from the scene. Once inside the ambulance, myself and EMT Tara Patterson did a thorough sweep of Preacher and were able to locate an apparent gunshot wound which had entered just in front of his right side hip, apparently exiting the back of his upper left leg. Preacher remained conscious and alert for the entire transport, which was no easy task as the rig operator, Alan Auclair, battled severe weather and road conditions. Dogs are unbelievable interpreters of nonverbal communication, and during this trip, while myself and EMT Patterson conducted a sweep for any other wounds manipulating Preacher's entire body, it was as if he completely understood that she was only there to help him, and he was completely content with her presence. During that ride, I was a mess. I continuously talked to Preacher as if he could understand everything I was telling him. I just continuously told him how proud of him I was and thanked him for everything he had done. By the time we arrived at Presque Isle Animal Hospital, which would have normally been closed, several members of their staff, which had been contacted and in some instances woke up out of their beds to respond, had preceded us, had the facility open, or were awaiting us in the parking lot with a transport board and no shortage of helping hands. We immediately got Preacher inside, where they quickly assessed him, began flowing IV fluids, scanned his intestinal area, ultimately making the determination that he needed to be rushed into surgery to treat internal bleeding. From that point on, the Presque Isle Animal Hospital staff worked tirelessly and without pause to stabilize Preacher's wounds. As the surgery progressed, it had become apparent that Preacher was in dire need for a blood transfusion, and the challenge was that the closest place this could be done was the Eastern Maine Emergency Veterinary Hospital in Brewer, approximately 165 miles from where we were. Urgent efforts were made to stabilize and ready Preacher for the transport. During the journey from Presque Isle to Brewer, we battled the same poor road conditions and an active winter storm. As a result of the same, helicopters could not fly, and expeditious travel was very hampered. Our team was not deterred by these challenges, and it became an all-hands-on-deck approach to try and get Preacher moved to the next level of care he needed. One of our team medics, Pat Hall, intercepted the transport while we were en route and remained with him, monitoring Preacher diligently while actively conferencing with multiple doctors and veterinarians on multiple phone lines, working through every possible contingency along the way. On the evening of February 3rd, Preacher fought like a true warrior on the battlefield, undoubtedly altering what could have been a horrific outcome for public safety, running unhesitatingly into danger, unthwarted by the opposition he faced, and prioritizing the safety of me, his teammates, and his pack, not to mention countless citizens that were gathered in the village spectating as this whole situation evolved. In the aftermath of his tide-turning engagement with a very dangerous suspect who had already demonstrated heinous acts of violence, Preacher continued to valiantly fight for his life. Just after 1 a.m. on February 4th, while just over halfway to the next level of care that Preacher needed, the enormous heart that he had demonstrated to me 2.5 years ago and to all of us on this night that had been so filled with evil stopped beating. Ultimately, we lost Preacher on a cold, dark, stormy night on the side of Interstate 95 while he was surrounded by his grateful, humbled, and devastated teammates. Preacher, I want you to know that from the first hot August night I met you, I knew you were special. Your absolute desire to serve and satisfy a human companion and to become a part of a pack was so evident, nothing has ever been clearer in my life. I knew you were special from that first day I met you, and that you were capable of literally anything. The courage you displayed to me in a testing environment on the first night I set eyes on you gave me constant reassurance and complete confidence that you would be my protector until you had drawn your last breath. There is a void in my heart and in my soul that you filled that will carry on in your memory from now until Valhalla, should I earn the right to meet you there. I am thankful for the time and the privilege I was given to be your handler, and I cannot possibly concoct a series of words that would even begin to describe how proud of you I am. I am eternally grateful for your courage, your sacrifice, and everything you did when duty called, and you will forever be my hero. I love you, Preach.
Let us pray. Almighty God, giver of life and creator of every living creature, we thank you that you are the source of joy and peace in times of pain and sorrow, and the source of hope even in times of loss. We are grateful to you for the life of Preacher and his service to JR, to the Maine State Police, and to our state of Maine. God, we thank you for this time, not only to express and share our grief and sorrow, but to be encouraged and strengthened through the words and actions shared here today in this ceremony. May the joy and love that JR experienced with Preacher far outweigh the pain of his loss. And I ask you to continue to help him and bless him in the days ahead. And God, as we leave here today, may we go forward with the determination to fulfill the mission to protect and serve. God, I ask for your continued blessing of protection on all law enforcement. And I ask for the safe travel as we go our several ways. And it is in your holy name that I pray. Amen.
Thank you all for attending today's service. This concludes the ceremony. I will now turn it over to the Maine State Police Honor Guard for dismissal.